can't look at the rocket launch, the trophy wives of the astronauts, and I won't listen to their words, 'cause I like birds.
When I say kia ora to you, you say kia ora back to me. That's how we do this in New Zealand, yeah? So kia ora. Kia ora. Very nice, thank you. How many of you have been to New Zealand? A lot of you. So you'll have heard firsthand about the whole kia ora thing and the whole Kiwi thing. But I'm really excited to be here to tell you about this work that I was so privileged to do as a postdoc. Up until just recently, even. I'm still working on Kiwi at the moment, but not really tracking them anymore, right? Because you need to be in New Zealand 8 months out of the year to track a Kiwi. It's a real undertaking. So I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and tell you about this work. So the formal title of my talk here, Cryptic Inbreeding and Dispersal in New Zealand's Rarest Kiwi. But also I noticed it was, advertised more like, so how to catch a Kiwi. So we're going to lean into that as well a little bit here. So I'm going to tell you about all that stuff. Inbreeding. Louder. Yeah. Is this okay? Okay. All right. Inbreeding in Kiwi, what we can learn using genetic tools about dispersal in Kiwi and therefore some social behaviors. And then, of course, in order to do all this work, we have to be able to catch Kiwi, which is a whole undertaking of its own. And this is work that, again, I'm at University of South Carolina at Aiken, and they support this work, continued work, but it's done in collaboration with the Department of Conservation in New Zealand, the Alan Wilson Center, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, and also most recently with Te Papa, the National Museum. All right, so aside from how to catch a Kiwi, there's 3 main points we're going to cover here. The first is just a bit of background on Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Kiwi. And then I'm going to tell you about 2 case studies with 2 different species of Kiwi. They are each the rarest of the Kiwi species. So what we've learned about inbreeding in little spotted Kiwi, and then about genetic population structure in Roe. So just starting with this first bit here. So New Zealand is a really isolated place. It's not an easy place to get to. And evolutionarily, ecologically, that makes it very, very special. So we're just looking at a map of the world here to get our bearings. This is New Zealand, way down here in the Pacific, right? So here's Baja Peninsula, here's Alaska, Russia, Australia, Hawaii's out here, right? So it's incredibly remote. New Zealand, it's an island nation. It's made up of 2 large islands with a bunch of small islands surrounding it. And it was one of the first pieces of the supercontinent of Gondwana to break free and sort of float off independently. And so, and that was about 80 million years ago. And so people talk about New Zealand as having been in a state of splendid isolation for 80 million years. And what that meant was that a whole lot of species that aren't found anywhere else in the world evolved in New Zealand and are still there, okay? And here's just a handful of them. We've got, and for those of you that have been to New Zealand, and even just, people who have been reading up on it will be familiar with some of these, right? So these are the tailed or lepelma frogs. These are weta. This is the kakapo, the world's only flightless, nocturnal, it's a ground-dwelling lekking parrot. Tuatara, it's last living representative of an entire order of reptiles, only found in New Zealand, only 1 species in the world. Some plants here, we've got the hutakawa, which is New Zealand's Christmas tree. We've got these tree ferns. Those are ferns that literally are trees. And of course, we've got Kiwi up here. The fauna in New Zealand is almost entirely devoid of native mammals. Okay, there's only 2 native mammals in New Zealand, and they're both bats, and they're nectar feeding bats. Okay, so what we've got are a whole suite of species that are only found in New Zealand and evolved not just in isolation from other parts of Gondwana, but in isolation from mammalian predators. Okay. So now we fast forward. One of the other interesting things about New Zealand, so it's one of the first places to break free of Gondwana land, but it was also one of the most recent large landmass to be colonized by humans. Okay, so 80 million years ago, New Zealand breaks free from Gondwana, but only about 700 to 1,000 years ago did we have any humans show up to settle in New Zealand. Okay, and these were Polynesian explorers. So Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, arrived maybe 800 years ago. After that, only about 200 years ago, did we get Europeans arriving and colonizing. The first group of Europeans, I'm trying to remember the story, but it was like, I think it was the Dutch, and they arrived, but they did not fare well with the Maori, and they left and didn't come back for decades. But eventually, we've got Europeans arriving here and settling in New Zealand 200 years ago. Both of these waves of human settlement brought introduced mammalian species with them. Okay. A lot of these mammalian species were predators, and they were brought along for culture, hunting, for example, and also just for food. So Maori had typically brought pigs with them. They brought dogs. They brought rats or mice. But of course, Europeans did too. And Europeans brought a really broad array of mammalian species, largely through these things called the acclimatization societies, where they brought a whole bunch of species over from Europe that they liked to hunt, so that they could then continue the hunt in their new land, yeah? Okay, so we've also got people settling, they're clearing a lot of native bush, and so with both of these waves of human settlement, we see a real loss of native species. I want to note also that not just were people clearing land and bringing in introduced predators or introducing predators, but there was a lot of collection of native species for different purposes. This picture over here, these are people with a bunch of tuatara, and they're collecting tuatara actually for a zoo. Somewhere in the UK, they were being sent back. All right. So what we've got is a wave of human settlement followed by a wave of extinction of these endemic species that really didn't have, via evolution, any defenses to these mammalian predators because they hadn't evolved in the presence of them. All right, so New Zealand then is just full of really exciting study systems if you're a biologist, right? A lot of the native species that are there, the endemic species that are super unusual and found only in New Zealand, have experienced range contractions, extreme reductions in population size. Many of them have experienced what are called founder effects, which is a population being started with just a handful of individuals that have been moved or translocated. And at the same time, we also have, for some of these species, very little genetic data or no genetic data, but excellent records of translocation and population growth. So some of these species, there are records of exactly how many were moved by whom and when, from where to where, and that sort of thing. So those are really valuable records to then pair with contemporary genetic data to get a better picture of things like what are the effects of reproductive skew and inbreeding in these birds, or whatever species you're talking about. This down here, this picture, this is a little spotted Kiwi chick. All right. And of course, a lot of these really fantastic endemic species are also endangered in New Zealand. So as a conservation biologist, you have a real opportunity down there to work on species that are not just interesting, but also really, make a dent in helping with management and conservation and persistence of these unusual species. All right. So Kiwi are beloved in New Zealand. Any of you who have been down there, I don't have to tell you that. You see their little image everywhere. This is a collection here of some of my favorites. We've got, the $1 coin, an 1898 stamp, shoe polish. That's actually why Kiwis call themselves Kiwis, right? So during the war, this was the shoe polish that New Zealanders were given in their kits, and they'd be over in Europe polishing their boots. And so they were called Kiwis because of their shoe polish. One of my favorites down here, Taste of New Zealand. What do you think that's an ad for? I'll just tell you, you'll never guess. Bacon. Bacon, yes. And then this here, this is the logo, the emblem of the Royal Air Force in New Zealand. A flightless bird, yeah? Okay, they are everywhere. They're everywhere. They're beloved. You'll see them. If you've been to New Zealand, you might recognize this mountain. That's called Ngārahoe, also known as Mount Doom from Lord of the Rings, right? So this is Mount Doom, and it's in this national park. And so the national park is full of kiwi, and there's these little road signs. Please don't hit the kiwi when you're out here traveling around Mount Doom. And then also I should just point out that in the Maori culture, kiwi are also beloved. Yeah, so they're thought of as a taonga or a treasure. They're thought of as kin, family to the iwi or the tribes in New Zealand. And for a long time, they were revered for, I guess you would say that these cloaks that they built were revered. They make them out of bird feathers, but the cloaks that are made out of kiwi feathers, these cockahoo cloaks, were incredibly rare, incredibly valuable. And these are the kind of things that today you'll only see those in Te Papa National Museum. Okay, so kiwi are, they're beloved. They are the national bird, but they're also beloved to evolutionary biologists and ecologists because they are part of a really rare avian lineage. Okay, and so by studying kiwi and these rare avian, this rare avian lineage of paleognats, we can learn a lot about the evolution of birds and also vertebrates in general. So paleognats are the most basal of all the avian lineages. They actually make up only about 1% of all of the extant birds on the planet. The other 99% fall into a group we call the neognats. Okay, but the paleognats include all of these guys pictured here, right? And all which are flightless and often called the ratites, plus this guy, which is a flighted tinamu. He's not a ratite, but he is a paleognat. Okay, so paleognats have a southern hemisphere distribution. So the emu and the cassowary there are found in Australia, the rheas in South America, the ostriches in Africa, kiwis in New Zealand, tinamus in South America, right? So they all have a southern hemisphere distribution. And what sets paleognats apart from neognats is a suite of unusual, morphologies, largely skeletal. So for example, they all have a certain kind of palate that is quite primitive and reptile-like. They have a really unusual pelvic structure and that kind of, and so on. Most of the paleognats are flightless. Most are large-bodied. Most are herbivorous, largely apneumatic. And what that means is that their bones are hollow. I'm sorry, let me back up. Apneumatic means that their bones are not hollow. Pneumatic means they are hollow. Okay, so they are largely apneumatic, okay, and that has to do with this flightlessness thing. And they have these hair-like feathers. So they have these feathers that lack a structure called a barbule, and so it doesn't hold all the little pieces of the feather together in a way that we usually see in feathers. They actually are kind of like really wispy, like marabou or something, right? So they have these hair-like feathers. So all of these birds here, these flightless ratites, they have really solid bones that are full of marrow. That's what I mean by apneumatic, whereas most birds have hollow bones, and it has to do with flight, right? These birds also they lack a keeled sternum. They lack the big flight muscles that are involved, big breast muscles. They have a very reduced furculum or wishbone, which is also involved in flight, and they have really reduced wings. Now, some of them have pretty big wings, like the rhea, and the ostrich, but they only use those for flailing around for display. They're not using them to fly anywhere. And other ratites have incredibly reduced wings, like kiwi. If you look around in there, you'll see they have just little tiny wings. Moa didn't have any wings at all. All right. So kiwi are part of this basal avian lineage, the paleognats. Now, these ratites, which are all of these paleognats that are extant minus tinamous, they are really the largest birds in the world. And not just now, but also historically, okay? So this right here is what we call a phylogeny. It's just a tree diagram showing how these different lineages of paleognats are related to each other. The shaded out birds are extinct lineages. And up here, we've got the elephant bird of Madagascar, and down here we have the moa of New Zealand. All of these little figures of birds are scaled relative to each other by body size. Okay, so as I said, ratites are the largest birds in the world, but particularly so if you look at the extinct forms. The elephant bird of Madagascar up here, this was a bird that could weigh greater than 400 kgs. And had eggs the size of a watermelon. Okay. Now, interestingly here, the closest relative to the extinct elephant birds is the kiwi, which is the only really small flightless paleognat. Okay. But long story short, we've got this little diagram here is meant to indicate that we've got a massive extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous. That's what did in the dinosaurs. And then after that, we'll see a diversification or a whole bunch of branching into different forms of these paleognats. And essentially from there, we now know that they flew to all these different locations in the Southern Hemisphere and then lost flight once they were there. It used to be thought that they lost flight prior to the breakup of the Southern Hemisphere continents and then rafted apart. But it turns out actually they diversified much later than that. And we've got some common ancestor of paleognats actually flighted and dispersing. And then losing flight is a really easy and common thing to do among birds. And so every black arrow on this figure is showing you a different independent loss of flight in this lineage. Okay. So these guys lay really large eggs in general, but I think the real point of this slide here is just to show you how tiny the kiwi is relative to all of the other ratites. So now if we zoom in, sorry, not just ratites, but paleognats. So now if we zoom into the kiwi in particular, this is the family Apterigidae. There's a total of 5 species recognized at the moment, and they fall into 2 clades, the spotted kiwi and the brown kiwi. Now, the kiwi themselves split off from the birds of Madagascar, those elephant birds, about 50 or 60 million years ago. But this clade of spotted versus brown kiwi, they split from each other maybe 8 or 10 million years ago. So these are still pretty deep divergences, pretty old events. So the 2 birds I'm going to be talking to you about today are the roe, which is the rarest of the kiwi species, and the little spotted kiwi, which is the second rarest. So we've got 1 spotted kiwi and 1 brown kiwi. And again, these kiwi figures here are scaled to the average size of that species. So you can really see if kiwi are tiny compared to the other ratites, little spotted kiwi are really, really little. They're like the size of a bantam chicken. Right. Now, kiwi, as I said, you know, with paleognats, there's a bunch of traits that set them apart from neonats. But then there's a bunch of traits that kiwi have that set them apart from all the other paleognats and all of the ratites. Okay, so for example, these birds are flightless and nocturnal. They are nocturnal and fossorial. That sets them apart from the other ratites. So they come out at night, they tend to hide during the day, and they live in and nest in burrows underground. They form long-term monogamous pair bonds. We think they can live for up to 60 years or more. They have extremely large eggs and a very long incubation period. So if you look in this picture in the upper right-hand corner, this is an X-ray. Can you see the egg in there? Yeah, that egg represents about 20% of the body weight of that bird. In humans, a child is about 5% of the mother's body weight, right? So laying this egg is about the equivalent of giving birth to a 6-year-old child. So they have extremely large eggs. And there's been a whole argument, we can talk about it later if you like, was the egg always big and the bird got smaller? Or, was the bird small and the egg got bigger and that kind of thing. All right. The chicks are precocial. And so we have this really long incubation period where these eggs are underground in the dark for a couple of months, right? But then when they hatch out, the chicks look just like little tiny adults. So this is a male little spotted kiwi. They're the ones that do the incubating in that species. And this is his son. This is Lancelot. I don't think his son has a name, but anyway, you can see that the chick here looks just like the adult. The only reason you can make out he's a chick is because he's sitting next to an adult. So they come out fully feathered from the egg, precocious, ready to go. Within a couple days, they're leaving the burrow and foraging on their own. Okay, so kiwi are the only birds that have a nostril at the end of their bill. They have an enormous olfactory bulb, which gives them a really unusually large brain, given their body size. And again, they have this pneumatic skeleton, they have these bones full of marrow that are really heavy. They have paired functional ovaries, which is odd for a bird. Most birds only have one ovary that works. They have a really low body temperature. I mean, we could go on and on. These birds have a lot of really strange, I had never worked with birds before, and I could not have picked a bird that was less like a bird to work with. So these birds, they're actually in a lot of ways, they call them honorary mammals in the way that they behave in the ecosystem. All right. Now, in terms of conservation status of the kiwi, again, there's 5 species. This is a map here of New Zealand, and the colored bits are showing you the current distribution of the 5 species of kiwi, right? Color-coded for each of the 5. And every one of these 5 species of kiwi has experienced a really strong range contraction from where it was found historically. It's now in a much smaller area, and genetic bottleneck effects associated with that. 4 of the 5 species of kiwi are listed as threatened according to the IUCN. And where they are not managed in their current distribution, where they are not, there's not a captive incubation or a trapping program going on, the chicks are largely predated on, and the populations are declining at a rate of 2 to 3% per year. Okay, the principal threats, of course, are predation from these introduced mammalian predators, habitat loss, also traps, sometimes that are set for the predators, sometimes get the kiwi, or that are set, somebody's out trapping, and genetic erosion, I would add to that, is becoming a real concern. And hopefully after I give you some idea of the genetics going on in the 2 rarest species, you'll have some idea why I'm saying that's the case. Okay. So New Zealanders are, they're sort of a DIY lot, yeah? They're always happy to take on a challenge. And when it came to their national bird, they have made heroic efforts, and still are, to conserve kiwi. And one of the weapons in their arsenal is this captive incubation program called Operation Nest Egg, or ONE. And Operation Nest Egg is a program where birds are radio tagged, males are radio tagged, and they are tracked until a nest is found. And then the Department of Conservation goes in and takes out the eggs at a very specific period of time in incubation. So that's what these guys are doing in this photo here. They're doing an egg lift or an egg rescue. Okay. This is what a couple of eggs sitting in a nest burrow would look like. And then they take these eggs and they put them in little beer coolers, and they helicopter them to a captive incubation facility where each little egg is incubated and monitored until a chick is safely hatched out and looked after until it reaches a certain size. And then those chicks are taken to a predator-free kiwi creche, right? So it's sort of like what we would call like a daycare or a kitty care, a kiwi creche. So this is them taking a box of these little birds out to a predator-free sanctuary, and they're going to hang out there until they reach an even bigger size to where they can actually fend off a stoat, or which is like a kind of weasel, right? Then they go back and do the whole thing in reverse. They go back and capture those birds. They take them back to where they got them as eggs, and they let them go. But now, presumably, they're big enough to fend off any mammalian predators. Okay, so this is it's really effective, this program. It's been going on for some time now, but it's obviously really involved. It's not cheap. Yeah. All right. So there is a massive effort around kiwi conservation in New Zealand, mostly around predation, controlling predation, and mostly around trying to increase the numbers of birds. The work that I do and that I did with Kiwi is more about looking at the genetic traits in the birds to try and understand if there are cryptic threats going on in the background that we're unaware of, like inbreeding or losses of genetic diversity. And also, what can we learn about sort of the history and the ecology and the mating system of birds from their genetic makeup. So I'm going to give you two examples now of studies that we did down there. One in little spotted kiwi. We'll start with that one, and then we'll talk about roe. All right, so again, this is a map of New Zealand here. This is a very angry little spotted kiwi right there. But this is the species we're talking about to start with. Little spotted, those black little kiwi figures are showing you the historical distribution of little spotted kiwi. So they used to be found all throughout New Zealand, apart from maybe the very farthest northern part. By 1900, the little spotted kiwi had gone extinct in the North Island of New Zealand, and it was declining throughout the South Island. In 1912, someone became alarmed about this and actually took 5 little spotted kiwi that they found down at Jackson Bay, down here in South Westland, and moved them up to an island called Kapiti Island up here for safekeeping. And then in the meantime, by the 1980s, all of the little spotted kiwi on the mainland went extinct. And the only birds that were still surviving were the ones on Kapiti Island. Now, again, 5 birds were put on there. Today, there's something like 1,700 little spotted kiwi on that island. And they are used as a source of founders to start new kiwi, little spotted kiwi populations throughout New Zealand. Okay. So, sorry, I guess today we've got about 1,900 little spotted kiwi. It's, the number keeps increasing, right? And at this point, there's 11 predator-free sanctuaries in each of the locations where you see a little black kiwi figurine here. And all of them are increasing population size, but all of them descended from 5 birds that were on Kapiti Island back in 1913. So the research questions for little spotted kiwi were, and the Department of Conservation was worried about this. They said, well, we have all these kiwi, and we can make more of them, but we're a little worried. They might have all come from very few birds. So the questions were, how much genetic diversity remains in little spotted kiwi, and where exactly is it? And then, is there any evidence of inbreeding depression? So before I get into telling you the answers to those questions, let's talk first about how you actually go about studying a kiwi, because before we can get to any of this, before you can get to any of the data, you have to first catch kiwi and sample them, right? Which is no small undertaking. Because again, these things are they're coming out at night, they're living underground, they are hiding, they're very good at it. Right. So here's us going out to catch kiwi in the first instance. And this is a crack crew here that is undertaking something as ridiculous as it looks. So we've got big fishing nets, right? We've got big dip nets. We've got dogs with us. We've got fluoro, like vests, and we're going out at night. And this is how you catch birds that you've never caught before. Okay, so what we would do is we'd go out to an area where we thought we'd heard kiwi before at night, set up a little recorder, a little speaker, and then we'd all kind of gather sort of at some distance, not too far, little distance around it with our nets in the dark, turn off our headlamps, and play the call and wait to see if anybody stomped in to defend their territory. And then if they did, the headlamps would come on and the nets would start waving and we'd try and get this bird. Okay. And we actually, you know, some of these guys are really, really good at it. They've been doing it for ages. And, you know, if we're lucky, we catch a bird like this. So then what you would do is you would, you know, take the measurements on the bird that you need. You'd weigh it. You'd collect genetic samples. In our case, we take feathers and blood. So if you see here, this is a good example of those feathers I was telling you about that are hair-like, that don't have the barbules. And then we put a radio transmitter on that bird so that we could find it again later, right? So in order to catch the bird for the first time, you have to go through this nighttime thing, but then you've got a radio transmitter on them and you can actually radio track the bird after that and go out during the day. Again, you often will take a dog with you for that, but you tromp around the island and you really hope that once you actually find them, they aren't somewhere like this. Because once you hear one over there, that's where you're supposed to go to get that bird, right? There's no way you're going to get out there to get that bird. So you'd have to just back away and hope for a better location at another time, come back. What you hope for is this, that there might be, and you never get this. This is the best case scenario. Usually what you hope for is a hole that you could get near, right? A burrow that you could get near and that isn't too deep that you could get into it. You never see them just sitting staring at you. I don't remember how that happened, but anyway, so you radio track these birds and you're trying to find where they are. What we were ultimately trying to get at for a lot of these birds was not just the genetic samples, but we wanted to figure out where their nests were so that we could figure out what sort of nesting success they were having. And so we would track these birds until we kept finding them in the same location over and over and over again. And once that happened, we knew they were on a nest. We knew generally where the nest was, but it was often really hard to find the actual nest. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute here. These radio tags that we use were really cool. We developed those for this work. They're a certain kind of tag called a smart tag. They have a mercury switch in them. And based on how that mercury switch was behaving and what we knew about the behavior of the birds, it could collect all this really cool data on the individual bird's behavior and movement and output it in a code that came out as a series of beeps. So what that meant is we could just go around and listen for the bird, and when we heard them, we could just sit down and write down the number of beeps, not disturb the bird at all, not actually go up to its burrow, not catch the bird. Just if we could get close enough to hear the radio tag, we could write down this code, and it would tell us things like days since change, or days since nest abandonment, that they'd abandoned the nest and how many days it had been, how much battery life was left in the tag, how many days there was a hatching event and how many days ago that happened. Okay, so we could download all this information without disturbing the bird using these smart tags. And then, of course, we were using the tags to try and find nests. And once we found a nest, we would use a burrowscope to figure out how many eggs were in that nest, and we would monitor the nest to see how many of those eggs hatched out, and then we would sit outside that nest at dusk, like this, right? Waiting for the chick to come out, and really hoping we didn't miss it. Because if you did, you'd have to come back the next night at dusk and do that again, okay? But it wasn't always easy to find the nest. I mean, oftentimes we could find the nest, but we wouldn't find the opening. So if you look here on the right, I'm going to show you a short video here. Sometimes what we do is say, well, there's a nest here and we can't make out where. So we're going to set up a camera and let the bird tell us where it is. So look at the beginning here. Can you imagine where this bird's about to go? He's about to go into a nest. It's a little spotted kiwi male getting back into his nest to incubate eggs. right? So there's no way we could come upon this and we'd be like, I know he's under there somewhere. So the cameras were really an invaluable tool. Yeah. Oh, the dogs are very well trained, yes. So people and dogs have to be go through a massive vetting procedure to be allowed to go anywhere near these birds. And the dogs in particular, there's a big training process. And the dogs are invaluable, really, because for the same reason that we needed the cameras. You know, you can often come and say, well, there's a bird around here somewhere, but I can't find it, but the dog could. Or if you were out there looking for birds so let's say you catch a bird at night, we wanted to track the males because they were incubating chicks. What if you catch a female, right? Well, then you would track that female and then you would hope to find her male near her. So if I can find the female and I have a dog, the dog can find the male, right? So they're really something to watch. They're like hunting dogs in the sense that they're very good at finding Kiwi, but they're incredibly disciplined. It is for little spotted Kiwi, but when I talked about Rowie, that's males and females. They take turns. Yeah, these are really good questions. Are there other questions? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Is there a point in the end of the process where a bird is no longer a bird?
No. I think so. But that's my bird-centric view. Like, you know, as far as I'm concerned, reptiles are just birds without feathers. So that's a good question. Not in this scenario. I think you'd have to go really far back to find any common ancestor that's anywhere near a mammal. What you're looking at, and this is a very deep ancient lineage, so we're talking about too far back. What we're seeing here is a convergent evolution issue. And I think you're aware of that, right? That like the idea here is that there's a bunch of traits that are mammal-like in Kiwi that they have evolved because they've kind of had taken on that lifestyle, right? And so they've kind of converged on similar traits as some mammals. But what you're asking is, can they go so far in that direction that they actually are neither a mammal nor a bird anymore? And theoretically, yes, but it would be much farther down the evolutionary route than they're at. Yeah. All right, let's carry on here. Now, okay, we've caught all of our birds. We've got the genetic samples. We've taken them back to the lab. We've extracted DNA, and we have genotyped them at a whole suite of genetic markers. The type of genetic marker is called a microsatellite. And for this particular study, I believe we were using 15 microsatellites. And this is going to give us an indication of our first question. How much genetic variation is left in little spotted Kiwi? And in this case, we're looking at it relative to other Kiwi species. So this table here is listing all 5 of the currently recognized Kiwi species, which, by the way, there's probably more like 11, and that's being worked on. But out of 15 markers, how many of them were variable? That's this first column here. And then these last 2 columns here, the only thing you need to be aware of there, HE means heterozygosity, AR means allelic richness. The only thing you need to know about that is that they're both measures of genetic variation. The higher the number, the greater the genetic variation. And so what I think is pretty clear here with little spotted Kiwi is that relative to all the other Kiwi, they have extremely low genetic variation, don't they? So little spotted Kiwi have very low heterozygosity and very low allelic richness compared to all the other Kiwi. And they're the only species that's gone through a species-wide bottleneck. Now, if you dig a little deeper, we've got a similar table here, except now every row is a different population of little spotted Kiwi. So all this data, everything in here is little spotted kiwi now, but every row is a different island population. Okay, this first one here, Kapiti, that is the island that had like 5 birds put on it and then went up to like 17 or 1900 birds. And that is the source of founders for all of the other populations of little spotted kiwi that are listed here. Okay, and again, we've got heterozygosity, we've got allelic richness. And if we look at those, we can see mean heterozygosity, while it's really low in little spotted kiwi generally, and that's well measured by the Kapiti line here, relative to Kapiti Island, all of the populations that were founded with birds from Kapiti Island have even lower genetic variation. And you can see that in the allelic richness as well. Kapiti has low allelic richness, but all of the populations founded with birds from Kapiti have even lower allelic richness. What does that mean? Well, it means that these birds have been serially bottlenecked. They went through an initial bottleneck with the founding of Kapiti Island, and they've gone through subsequent bottlenecks with the founding of additional populations since. The biggest signal you can see here is in this population called Long Island. Okay, so Long Island, if you see, it's got a 20% reduction in heterozygosity relative to the already bottlenecked Kapiti. It's got a full third of the markers that we looked at are completely devoid of any genetic variation. Okay, so then the question is, well, what is going on Long Island? Enter Dr. Helen Taylor. She's was a PhD student on this project, and she went out and built a pedigree for all the birds on Long Island. And here's what we learned. Out of the birds that were put on Long Island, only 2 of them ever reproduced. They were 2 birds that were brought together from Kapiti, created a pair, and have been churning out chicks ever since. Every bird on that island is an offspring of that pair. Okay, so what we have here is a pair of Kapiti Island birds that are themselves, as far as we know, not inbred. I mean, they could be, but we're going to assume for this study that they're not. They have a bunch of offspring. All of their offspring are full siblings with each other, and they aren't inbred either. They're just brothers and sisters, right? But then they start mating with each other. Now, again, they have long-term monogamous bonds, so they're not mating with their parents, but they are mating with each other. And all of these F2s, we would call them, are highly inbred. The offspring of a full sibling mating has an inbreeding coefficient of what we call 0.125. That's very high. Okay, so these birds are inbred. She looked at hatching success in these birds because usually in birds, when we have inbreeding depression, the first indication is a low hatching success. Okay, and so here we see hatching success in Long Island. I'm not going to go through all of the figures on here. This is a comparison with another population in a sanctuary called Zealandia. But what's important is that down here, only 35% of the eggs that were laid were hatching on Long Island. We also had a really high instance of what we call double clutching. So these birds would lay a clutch of eggs, and rather than just having one, they'd have 2 eggs. And then they'd both fail, and then they'd go and have another clutch of 2 eggs. So these birds were putting out a massive effort to reproduce and getting very little success in. Yes, and that actually becomes a problem. At this stage, there's still great disagreement over what to do with these birds. Let's talk about that more in a minute here, because, so I just want to point out that what we found was that very few birds were surviving, very few were hatching, and then very few were surviving on Long Island. And if you looked at the sex ratio, most of the birds that were inbred that were dying were females. There was a sex bias in it as well, which we still don't understand why that is. But basically, here's this population that is growing in numbers of birds and was thought to be a real success story, right? Because it was founded on predator-free island, really well looked after, and just lots and lots more birds every year. But it turns out that was masking really high mortality and really high levels of inbreeding. All right, so for little spotted kiwi, we learned that extant little spotted kiwi have extremely low genetic diversity, that positive population growth rates, at least on Long Island, were really masking a lot of inbreeding depression. Okay, which brings us to your question. What do you do about this situation, right? One thing you could do is bring in birds from another population that has higher genetic diversity. But remember, in little spotted kiwi, that's tough because they really all came from the same bottleneck, right? So, but still they're, Kapiti, you could bring in some more Kapiti birds. They have a little higher variation than Long Island. You could do that. Or you could take some of the birds off Long Island and mix them in, right? But the concern here is taking birds that are inbred and intermixing them with birds that are not. And so at this stage, there's still a lot of discussion over what is the conservation value of the birds on Long Island, right? Should they be moved? Should they be rescued with outside birds brought in? It's still up for debate. Okay. Let's talk about Rowie, and then we can just have open questions. That'll be fun. Okay, so Rowie, that is the rarest of the kiwi species, right? And this is a species of kiwi that is critically endangered. It is the reason why Operation Nest Egg was started. The biggest threat to Rowie, and these are all pictures of Rowie on the bottom here, is predation. They live in one area, and there's massive trapping for stoats and mammalian predators in that area, but it's not fenced off, okay? So predation is the number one worry when it comes to Rowie. At this point, they have one wild natural population. They have a couple they've started in the last couple of years with founders, but the last remnant population in situ is in a place called Ogredo Sanctuary, and it has about 600 birds in it. A full third of the adult Rowie don't breed. We don't know why, and about half of their eggs fail in the wild. This is a species of kiwi that is known for being really territorial and super aggressive. Okay, we know from their genetic data that they also experienced a genetic bottleneck effect. This was associated with human settlement, maybe about 1,000 years ago, not with translocation. At the moment, as I was saying, there's about 600 birds in Ogredo Sanctuary, but genetically, they're behaving really in what we call an effective population size of 60 birds. And that has to do with loss of genetic diversity due to this bottleneck. Okay, so there's still a lot of unknowns with Rowie. We don't know about natal dispersal patterns. We don't know about their social structure. It's interesting that they're really, really aggressive, but at the same time, they're also known for sometimes being found in little, like 3 or 4 in a burrow together, which you don't normally find in kiwi. And we don't know anything about their fine scale structure. So that was really the focus of this study. What is the genetic population structure of Rowie on a really fine scale, and is it sex biased? All right, so here's a map showing you a couple of things. This shaded area here is showing you the historical distribution of Rowie. They are now found only where there's this one little dot here that says Ogredo. If you zoom in on Ogredo, this is what Ogredo Sanctuary looks like. It's bounded by water on 3 sides and highway on a 4th. And every dot on this map is a Rowie that was sampled for this study. We sampled 300 birds, genotyped 300 birds at 30 of these microsatellite markers I told you about. Okay, and what we learned, well, we learned a couple interesting things. We learned that there is sex-biased population structure on a very fine scale in Rowie. And I'll walk you through how we know that here. All right, so what we've got on this axis here is a measure of how closely related two birds are to each other, okay? And what we've got on this x-axis here, those numbers represent the distance between two capture points of a pair of birds. Okay, so what this is telling us is that, is there any kind of relationship between how closely related birds are and how far apart or close they are to each other in terms of their territory? We see a bit of a signal of isolation by distance here, where at this end of the graph, this dark line is telling us that there's higher relatedness between birds that are really close to each other spatially. But if you break that out by sex, you can see that's entirely due to males. Okay, so again, over here at the far left end of the graph, we see a signal where the males that are within, 1.5 kilometers of each other are closely related, but they're not closely related to males further away. And for the females, they're not closely related to any of the other females near each other. They're just as closely related to the neighbor as they are to the 110 kilometers away. And interestingly, in Oak Ridge Sanctuary, 12 kilometers is the furthest two birds could get apart from each other because it's a very small area. All right, if you map this out, these sort of little hot spots of relatedness by sex into Okarito, you'll see that there is what we call spatial autocorrelation. It just means high relatedness between individuals all over the place in males. And there's a bit of it in females, but it's really a male phenomenon. We also know that their territories are such that if we're talking about high relatedness between males within 2 kilometers of each other, that what we're actually talking about is neighbors. Neighboring territories, males in one territory and his neighbor, his closest neighbors, okay? So this figure kind of sums all of that up. We've got on the y-axis here, mean relatedness between two birds, and down here we've got for different categories of birds, right? So if you look at all the rowy, the mean relatedness between birds is around 0. If you look at just females, again, and this is with their nearest neighbor. If you look at females, they're not terribly closely related to their nearest neighbor any more than they are to anybody else. If you look at males and just their neighbors, the ones that are right next to their territory, you see an elevated relatedness. All right, so what does that mean for Rowie? Well, so for Rowie, we have one single population with a lot of structure and social structure. So it's sex biased and it's spatially structured at a very fine scale. This is interesting for a lot of reasons. For one reason is if you've got sex biased dispersal, that can reduce inbreeding, right? So if one sex always leaves and the other one always stays, then you're not going to have full siblings mating. Okay, so that's exciting. Happy about that. It might also help explain a little bit about this behavior that we've seen where they can be really territorial, but also sometimes you'll find 2 or 3 in a burrow. Early on in Operation Nest Egg, when they would take Rowie and bring them back to put them in the area where they'd been taken out as eggs, they often would be beaten to death by the adult Rowie. Those were the very, very early lessons from Operation Nest Egg. Now they take birds and they tend to put them back in areas where there, aren't as many birds. So, maybe little blank slates they can find in there. But it's getting really, or they're starting new populations with them too. We have a couple new populations of Rowie. So this might be the case that actually what we're dealing with here is a need for these birds to have some sort of period of time with their kin, right? And that may be why we find a couple of birds together sometimes in burrows, but also this thing where they won't tolerate outsiders. That's all speculation. There's a lot more work to be done before we can know any of that. But what we can say from these data is that it does appear that females have a tendency to disperse when they're young, female rowie, to disperse to find a mate and a territory, whereas the males tend to hang around, hoping potentially to get a piece of their parents' territory or one near them. Okay. And this is another little spotted kiwi. So with that, I would just like to thank all of you for inviting me to come and tell you about this. I'm happy to take any questions. I want to acknowledge that this kind of work requires a Herculean effort from so many people. All of the people who volunteered to help chase down Kiwi, all of the funding agencies and so forth. And also, I'm going to play this in the background for us while we talk more Kiwi here. This is a little loop of video that we have from our cameras of trying to catch whether or not there were eggs successfully hatching and where the nests were. So any questions, I'm very happy to take. Yes. So we've also done some really interesting work most recently on great spotted kiwi, and some comparisons between great and little spotted kiwi we're working on that now, more from a functional genomics perspective. Great spotted kiwi are interesting because they seem to still occupy most of their natural historical range. And they're also alpine birds. They're enormous and they live up above snow line. So we've done some similar work in them. And Tokoeka, they really need some work. They're down in Southwestland, in Fjordland, actually. And there's work ongoing in those too. North Island browns I don't tend to work with. Other people do. They're a real focus of other people. And because they're so, I don't know, their territories are so impacted by human settlement because there's so many people in the North Island. Yeah. So my group, we tend to study wild natural systems, and North Island brown kiwi isn't necessarily that compared to some of these others. Plus there's lots of North Island brown kiwi. So, and they're getting a lot of attention. So yeah, the kiwi in general, there's lots of work going on with them. Sorry, I should stand here. And I think there always will be. Because they're just too charismatic, you know? So yeah, there is lots of work. Plus also, there is a massive amount of money and energy in New Zealand going to save these species. Like I said, there's a lot more species than are currently recognized, so that's an active area of research as well. Yeah, okay. So in little spotted kiwi, we've just got the male incubating, and he'll go off for most of the night and then come back and be fine. Where we see males and females taking turns, it's usually further south or it's higher altitude. It's a colder situation, and it's different species like great spotted kiwi, Tokoeka. They tend to do that. North Island browns don't do that. Little spotted kiwi don't do that. But so this little spotted kiwi, that egg can sit by itself without anybody sitting on it every night for a couple of hours. This guy will go left to forage and then come back. But it's really warm and wet down, and it's often sometimes wet in those little burrows or little dark, warm spaces. And when you get in there, you know, there's a lot of like feathers, fluff, and duff and stuff. So they're really warm little places. But also, these guys aren't living in terribly cold places compared to, say, great spotted kiwi. Yeah, sometimes the only indication we have that a chick hatched is that we saw it on camera. So these are pictures of chicks coming out of nests, where we go back later and look at the footage and go, yeah, there was a chick there, you know? Of the chicks? The chicks they're about this big. They're about tennis ball size. Well, and I'm talking about little spotted kiwi chicks now. So little spotted kiwi chicks are about tennis ball size. And the parents are maybe bantam chicken size. So I would say rugby ball size or football size, except a lot of that's feather sometimes. Okay, so they're sort of like a small chicken, maybe. Say again? And the great spotted ones are really quite big. So yeah, if you, for example, one of the best ways to hold these birds, because you can crush them easily, right? They don't have a keeled sternum. They don't have a lot of musculature for flight. And so their little chests can get crushed, right? So one of the best ways to hold them is by their feet, like you might a chicken or something, right? So if you had a little spotted kiwi by his feet, yeah, that's a male come off his nest calling to his mate. Anyway, sorry. So if you're holding an adult little spotted kiwi by its feet, and it'll flop down with its bill pointing to the ground, and with its bill, it'll probably be about that big. Without its bill, it'll probably be about that big, right? But a great spotted kiwi would reach the ground. Here. So they're big birds. They eat a lot of invertebrates, but they're just fossing around for. Sorry, they eat a lot of invertebrates that they just fossing around in the ground for. Worms and little bugs and that kind of thing. What you're looking at here is a bird that is getting ready to leave his nest for the night. And really early on in incubation, it's important that they camouflage the opening. Okay. Now, so, and this will loop around so you'll get to see it again too, but basically they can spend ages coming out of these burrows and then tucking things in behind them to make it so nobody can see where they came out of the hole. And then they go off and forage and then they come back. And as the incubation period goes on, they spend less time camouflaging that hole. And the current thought is that actually it might help with evaporation with the egg, that actually at some point it needs to start sort of being exposed to air a little bit more. Yeah. Oh, this. Yeah, overall in managed areas, they're increasing. In unmanaged areas, they're decreasing. But I will say that they've made amazing strides even just in the last few years in New Zealand. So for example, they have started introducing little spotted kiwi to the greater Wellington area, which is the nation's capital, right? And that's not fenced off and predator free. So yeah, they're increasing. Where they're managed, they're increasing.
Eagles, maybe separated. Is it the same thing with the kiwi? They just basically stay together.
So a pair of kiwi are going to have a territory that they look after together as a couple, and it's full of a bunch of different burrows, some of which they use for nests, some of which they use just to hang out in. Sometimes they'll be in them together. Sometimes, more often, they'll be apart. But you know, it's not uncommon to reach into a burrow to pull a kiwi out and feel like there's 4 legs. So that does happen. So they do tend to stick together for decades. Okay, you can break them up, and you also there are divorces. There are divorces, and it does happen that there's widowers and such. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, let me tell you what's happening in this video. So this is a tuatara. You guys heard of tuatara? I told you, I mentioned it a little earlier. It's this, it looks like a lizard, but it's not a lizard. It's a reptile found only in New Zealand. It's, there's only one species, okay? And it's one of these rare endemics that it's like a living fossil kind of animal. So historically, tuatara and little spotted kiwi would have overlapped in range, but we don't find them together all that often anymore, right? But this was a place where we were radio tracking kiwi in a predator-free enclosed sanctuary called Zealandia, and they had tuatara in Zealandia as well. And we found that there was a kiwi burrow. We thought it was a kiwi burrow. My friends who studied tuatara thought it was a tuatara burrow that had both in it. And so we set up a camera and we're trying to figure out what was going on with this pair here, because tuatara have this thing where they like to hang out in underground burrows that belong to nesting seabirds. And it's known that they eat those seabird chicks. And it's also known that they sometimes just snuggle up to them to steal their body warmth. They're kleptotherms, tuatara. Okay, so we thought, well, maybe this tuatara is going to eat this kiwi chick because we knew there was an egg in there. So we just kept watching it, and I kept saying, you need to get your tuatara out of my kiwi burrow. And my tuatara friends were like, your kiwi is in our tuatara burrow. And anyway, we just watched it, and this is what happened. Did it stop? Let's see if we can go back to where they're. So this is, you can see the tuatara in there. His little face, this is the kiwi coming back to the burrow. He can't see so well, but he knows something's going on. He can smell. The toot is like, it's this guy again. And what we decided is that they really didn't know, neither of them was there for any specific purpose. They were both just very confused. So there's this thing where he's like, he wants to get in there and check on his egg. There's a tuatara in his way, though. He's not quite sure what to do about that. And then at some point, the tuatara is like, well, I just have to charge this guy. So he does. Well, it was, and then there's the chick coming out behind the tuatara. And so what we decided was, based on later on, after everybody moved out, we went in and looked at the burrow, and the way the burrow was shaped made it fairly clear that it had been dug by a tuatara. It was a tuatara burrow, but this kiwi had gone and put in an egg in there. So then it was a nest also. And so what you see here at some point, I think it's what's happening next, is oh yeah, that kiwi, that chick survived and was fine. But the kiwi, at some point, the tuatara tries to jump on the kiwi, and the kiwi starts stomping him with his feet, because that's kind of the only weapon a kiwi has, is its big feet. So here's where he starts stomping. But this was a really this was a really fun interaction to witness. Well, this one's in length is probably about that long, but but a lot of that's tail. A lot of that is tail, and the tail, is going to be about that big, and his head is going to be, that's the tail. That's his back and his tail. That's his back and his tail. So tuatara means spiny back. It's a Maori name, yeah. And he's got these spikes that run down his back. That's what the white is. And then past that is his tail. But some of these can get quite big and muscly, but not this one. This was a pretty small guy. Yeah. All right. If there's any other questions, I'm going to hang out and you guys can feel free to.
Thanks, Dr. Hudson.